Wait! Don't!
Do you ever just find yourself at exactly the right time and place? Well, that just happened to me. I just so happened to be finishing up my third playthrough of the Outlast series when I received an email with a free key for Shame Legacy by Fairyship Games, a first-person indie horror game focusing on stealth and puzzles. Once I got into it, I couldn't help but recognize Outlast 2's familiar imprint on the stealth, chase sequences and controls, down to how you walk along ledges, move objects from out in front of doors, even down to how you shimmy through narrow passageways to get away from enemies. So I feel particularly privileged and qualified to comment on Shame Legacy's quality, both as an Outlast homage and as an original experience. Unfortunately, what separates the boys from the men is polish and tuning, and Shame Legacy is in desperate need of both. So let's get into what does and doesn't work, and whether you should run like mad to get as far away from this one as you can.
Oh god. Shit.
Shame Legacy's story takes place in the late 1800s, and you play as an amnesiac named William Smith. William Smith? Like Will Smith?
Keep my name out your fucking mouth!
Wow, dude, it's just a Will Smith Oscars joke. Anyway, William Smith wakes up in the middle of the forest and soon hears the distressed cry of his daughter Rosie.
Rosie!
Which reminds me very muchly of how Blake hears Jessica's cry at the beginning of Outlast 2. Apparently, Williams just had another seizure.
What the hell am I saying?
Apparently, Williams just had another seizure, although why he has this specific of an affliction is never explained.
I had another seizure.
I know, William Smith. I just said that. You sure you're not Will Smith? Because he didn't know when to shut up either. So our man William trudges to the nearby village of Wakefield, where he's met by a vision of his priest, Father George, who says that Williams ruined the lives of everyone in the village. Father George feels guilty for not being able to fully turn William away from his family legacy, which is leading a cult, who have captured and sacrificed the residents of Wakefield for some time. Spoilers here, but it's never revealed to which entity and for what purpose these sacrifices are actually carried out, which is a truly impressive omission, as is why the inhabitants of Wakefield all look zombified like Bizarro from Superman. And because you've got blood in your shirt, bulging veins in your arms, and fingernails so dirty they look like toffee sticks, I wondered if the twist was that you'd become just like these zombie people or something. But this similarity goes nowhere. I guess you're just ugly. There's also no justification given for why there's a fire demon that keeps chasing you. Hell, for all I know, he may be what the cult worships, or he might just be an enforcer for the cult, but who knows? This confusion is unfortunate because it robs the moody and atmospheric scenes of needed context. You'll experience traumatic flashbacks as you travel through your old haunts in Wakefield, reliving a war scene that implies you left the cult to become a soldier at one point, a house fire that may have been started while you were away to get back at you for leaving, and a recurring scene where you may or may not have done something awful in the name of the cult later on. Or was it before? The timeline is very murky and doesn't seem to make sense from a cause and effect standpoint, so all this woe is me whinging that William and the others do rings hollow because I don't understand anyone's history or motivation. Like, it's obvious that William hates his father because he neglected William and his mother for the cult. You know, I'm guessing William was like, "Daddy, let's play catch." And Mr. Smith was like, "Not now, damn it. I'm trying to ritually sacrifice the neighbors." You know, that kind of thing that all sons go through with their fathers at some point. Just part of growing up, I guess. But beyond that, I couldn't tell you why the cult just loves murdering people right and left, what effect it has on the populace, or why exactly William finds himself to blame for any of it, other than the one thing that the game implies he sorta maybe did. But it's the equivalent of someone killing one enemy soldier in a battle, and then being blamed for a full war's worth of atrocities. It just doesn't line up. So without a compelling narrative to make any sense of, I was left to vibe out with the pretty decent art direction and music, although there are some pretty persistent performance issues threatening to undermine their effectiveness. For starters, the scarecrow on the menu screen has massive texture pop-in, which is not a good first impression. But hell, even Redfall had the same problem, so I guess if the big boys aren't exempt from making boo-boos, I can't hold an upstart indie dev too long over the fire for it. This first impression might compel you to lack faith in the visuals from there on out, but I was pleasantly surprised by a lot of the art design. It's not a sumptuous visual feast or anything, and there's a really weird glitter effect on anything gold and shiny that I've also seen in indie horror games like Grey Dawn and The Last Days of Lazarus, and since both are made by newer indie devs using Unreal Engine 4, I'm just going to guess that this is a hard effect to pull off in that engine. But aside from this fact and some weird looking facial models throughout, there's a pretty nice color contrast that favorably recalls Outlast 2's Misty Forest and Torchlight without outright copying it. I also have to commend Fairyship Games for managing to make mundane spaces like the mansion feel dreamlike by just brightening the color palette a bit or using ethereal background music. Other spaces are so gritty and dirty you can feel them, from caves infested with leeches to slaughterhouses filled with hanging pig carcasses. Other levels, like the battlefield, feel appropriately authentic and even have someone on a loudspeaker pushing war propaganda the whole time, which is a nice touch.
This is where you can make something out of your life.
There's a nice gothic or classical look to many environments as well, using stained glass and other religious imagery like alabaster or marble statues of Mary and Jesus to make the world feel mystical and pregnant with mystery. All in all, there's a lot of minute detail in the environments, and they're usually intelligently laid out, physically speaking, though we'll soon get into why they don't work very well as gameplay spaces. The game's fidelity is a little last gen to be sure, but the composition is solid, and I like looking at a lot of it, so let's move on to the sound. A lot of Shamed Legacy's atmosphere comes from its pretty decent soundtrack and sound design. Sound effects are rich and full, and the music has a lot of classical character, pounding with timpani as you try to outrun the fire demon. But most importantly, there's just a lot of ambient stingers and swelling, weird instrumentation and strings that keeps up tension even when nothing of particular note is happening. The very first Outlast is a game whose effectiveness relies a lot on its soundtrack, possibly more than any other horror game I've ever played, and if there's one good lesson that Shamed Legacy learned from that game and its sequels, it's that music can cover a multitude of sin. So good on them for their work in this department. Okay, so that's the musical side of things, so let's get down to voice acting real quick, which is a bit rougher in quality. Polish publisher Destructive Creations set up the voice acting as it's all done by Polish people speaking in English. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but there's a decent bit of localization awkwardness as a result, like multiple misspelled subtitles and achievement names, and some strange sentence structure and line delivery. But overall, the voice actors give honest attempts at delivering what is often a hokey and incomprehensible script, so kudos to them for trying. And try they do, sometimes perhaps a little too much.
I have a daughter! I have a daughter!
Oh, God.
I have a daughter!
So, like I said earlier, Shamed Legacy owes a lot of its constituent elements to Outlast, specifically Outlast 2. It's a religious horror story about a murderous cult terrorizing a village, set in a wooded area with tons of campfires and small wooden lodgings, has the same environmental interaction tropes, and focuses mostly on stealth sequences and some chase scenes, all that good stuff. Unfortunately, Shamed Legacy also apes Outlast 2 beyond just having a poorly told story. It's also a highly trial and error type of game to play, where you just sort of bump up against the obnoxious design and hope to make it through eventually. So, like Outlast, there isn't any light meter or vision cones to guide your sneaking around, so you're generally crouching and moving around various waist-high objects, staying just out of sight, waiting for enemy patrols to walk away so that you can slip past them. William's not a speedster though, and the patrols are often full of erratic AI or obnoxious overplacement of enemies, meaning your timing has to be laser precise to work, and that's if you can even figure out where you're supposed to go. A battlefield scene where you're crawling around broken equipment and trying to slip through tents is mind-bendingly confusing at first, as it's not quite clear what's a pathway and what's not, and even if you can find one, there are so many cultists walking around you'll often bump into them while just trying to get your bearings. And because you're too slow to jump out of sight, and there's no mechanic like the camera mic in Outlast 2 to gauge where enemies are coming from, you'll often have to repeat sections over and again in short little suicide runs just to know which way doesn't spell automatic death. This goes for the corn maze level as well, which may be even more confusing. What makes these so annoying is also the lack of readable or predictable enemy behavior. The zombie cultists have really erratic animations that make you think they're turning all the way around and going the other direction, but then they just pivot a bit and you've already lurched from your cover and are now spotted. Well, sometimes. You can be right in front of some enemies and they pay you no mind, and other times the slightest sound or non-crouched movement, even when out of their sight, will alert them immediately. The sound hazards are also kind of a pain to contend with. There's these little bramble patches that once stepped on crackle and pop like Rice Krispies, but they're nearly impossible to see as they blend right in with the dark areas you'll be slinking through. Worst of all, though, are the crucified people. These folks wail at you whenever you get close, and if they do it for too long, the fire demon will be alerted and auto-kill you. The placement of these guys can be misleading though. Sometimes they're to be completely avoided and the slightest cry will get you killed, and others are there as tests of skill, where you'll need to kind of run past them as quickly as you can and outrun the alert timer on their scream. But why some screams are automatic kills and others have arbitrarily longer timers that are meant to be raced against is confusing messaging when you're trying to plan out your runs. So trial and error it is, having to reload over and over while waiting through inexcusably long load times upwards of 10 to 30 seconds, and often having very few of the textures loading once you're back in game. So that's not great.
What is this shit?
But while the fire demon can never be rebuffed, any cultist that finds you can be, at least in theory. Fairyship made a welcome upgrade to the Outlast formula by giving you a cane to defend yourself if someone sees you and attacks. This is supposed to work where you get one cane defense opportunity that knocks out your attacker, and then you start hyperventilating and have to find a potion lying around to calm down before you can fight back again, a nod to the sanity mechanic in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. But sometimes the cane wrestling minigame just doesn't work, regardless of whether you're sane or not, and the cultist just kills you, but there's no real consistency. The minigame just shows up when it wants to, and if it doesn't, you're bumped back into a slow-ass loading screen to fight through another confusing and frustrating section. And sometimes, even if you've won the minigame, you've made enough noise to attract all the other cultists anyway, so you're dead all the same. It's just not balanced well, and I had to really suck it up hard to finish, as there were several sections I just about dipped out on. And this is playing on console. I've heard that the mouse sensitivity on this minigame is truly atrocious on PC, to the point where it's almost unplayable. So watch out for that if that's your platform of choice. But there is at least one stealth design feature that Fairyship Games really surpassed Outlast on, and that's adding a peek function to hiding places. You can hide in outhouses or chests or whatever's around in an area, and then push the door or lid up to look out through the crack and see if the coast is clear to get out. It's realistic, it's useful, and it's often the only way you're going to be able to beat some areas. It's suitably tense and it controls well enough. There's no accidental leaving your hiding place while doing so or anything like that, and it's honestly just something I wish that more stealth games would implement. I'll also have to commend Fairyship Games for pacing the game pretty well between narrative and, the various gameplay modes of exploration, stealth, and puzzles. You'll never spend too much time doing one thing, and the order in which you move from one to the other is rarely predictable. I also appreciate that sometimes the game just lets you walk for a bit, and then slowly introduces a heavy rain or something like that before you enter a cave or another village. The game isn't always up to something or prepping you for some scare, and I can really appreciate that. Another decent pacing choice that Fairyship made was to add these chase scenes that are right out of Outlast. These more or less on-rails sequences where you run smack dab into the fire demon and have to turn tail and run down a linear path to escape him. They aren't particularly interesting, but it is an honest attempt to introduce easy adrenaline to what is sometimes a very slow-paced game, and it'll make Outlast fans give a wry grin as they see one of the series' tropes played out in such obvious homage. And while the chase scenes sort of play themselves and the stealth's pretty clunky, Shame Legacy does have another gameplay pillar that I found to be its most enjoyable, which is its puzzles. They're certainly not brainbusters, but they're just involved enough to make you feel like you're doing cool, mystical things involving ornate artifacts, much like you would in the aforementioned Grey Dawn and Last Days of Lazarus. Oh, and remember that cane you got? Well, it's actually an old Smith family heirloom that can be fitted with medallions you find and used to solve various door puzzles by slotting it into pillars like a lever and turning it left or right. You'll eventually get some more complicated versions of these puzzles, where two pillars are going at the same time, and you'll have to enter different configurations between the two of them to match the combination on the doors you want to open. Again, they aren't mechanically intense or particularly brain-teasing, but they are a light and easy win for the player that gives the world that Da Vinci Code kind of feeling, where you're uncovering secrets and finding things out. So while there are a couple cool puzzles here, the last of them is not my favorite. So the last major section of the game is stealthing around a graveyard. It's suitably moody feeling and probably your most gracious stealth test so far, but you'll soon realize why. So at one point you grab a gate key and walk through a courtyard with a big statue in it and see the gate to the right of the statue. Okay, makes sense you would go to the gate and see what's next, right? That's what your inventory is telling you. But when you go through, you realize that you're back at the beginning of the graveyard again, which is disorienting enough as it is, but all the more so if you go down to the crypt to your right and find that the door you first saw on your way in that said you needed another medallion for your staff in order to open it still thinks that you need one. one. But you've gone through the whole graveyard already, right? And you didn't see any other medallions. You're right back where you started, so where is the damn thing? Oh, why, it's hidden in the totally nondescript corner behind the statue in the exact opposite direction of the gate that your inventory implied was your next destination. What? And then once you get said medallion, you get one of those puzzles where you have to rotate 4 rows of symbols and each switch turns a different number of rows, so you have to suss out the perfect combo so you're not constantly undoing your progress to make all the symbols match the top row. I've never been the biggest fan of this puzzle type anyway, but my real complaint here is how slow it is to switch between the different knobs, so it makes an already tedious process all the more so by interrupting your thought process as you have to wait for the slow-ass controls to respond. So because of weird choices like this, combined with the frustrating stealth, excruciating load times after your many deaths, and the utterly confusing story, it's a wonder that I still wanted to see this game through to the end. But there's something here, an it factor if you will, that kept me going, kept me rooting for the game to succeed. The art design doesn't look particularly current gen, but it's still consistent and dramatic enough to be engaging. It's also a welcome choice to spruce up Outlast's simple framework by adding a defense mechanic and a cool quality of life feature like the ability to peek out while hiding. But can I recommend Shame Legacy? With its $35 USD price tag, its 3 to 4 hours of playtime, and its often infuriating design, I can't make an honest recommendation at this time. $35 might be the most expensive small-scale indie project I've ever seen, too. I mean, for context, last year's indie smash hit Signalis was 10 hours bare minimum to beat, and it had multiple endings, and that never cost more than $20. I mean, price your game what you think your value is, and let the free market decide, but I just don't think that there's enough content here relative to the buyer's expenditure, and the gameplay is frustrating enough, I can't in good faith tell people to check this out unless it's on a deep sale.
What is this shit?
Should that sale come and you're really looking for something to scratch that Outlast adjacent itch, why not? The execution's unfortunately lacking, but I can at least tip my hat in Fairyship's direction and hope that they keep trying and improving their craft because their team definitely has some talent and a love of the game that I can appreciate. Fairyship should feel no shame for attempting actual gameplay instead of just some lazy walking sim with jump scares like most shovelware you see on Steam. So here's to the future Fairyship games, and may your legacy be without shame. And before we go, a special shout out to my lovely patrons. We've got Deadforge, Shantiva, Mark Neubauer, James Wyatt, and Hey Blondie. You guys rock face.